Welcome to Behind the Investigation with Atlanta News First. I'm Andy Parati. The Environmental Protection Agency recently issued new rules when it comes to a group of chemicals often found in drinking water. We're talking about PFAS or perfluoroalkyl, often referenced as the forever chemical because it does not break down naturally. It's found in numerous household products that we use almost every day, including nonstick cookware, food packaging, and even carpeting. And it's also linked to numerous health conditions like thyroid disease and some cancers. Joining me now to talk a little bit more about the new rules is Dr. David Andrews with the Environmental Working Group. Dr. Andrews, thank you for joining us.
Good, nice to be speaking with you today.
You have done extensive research on PFAS. If you can, help us understand what the old rules were and what the new rules are and why we should be caring about this.
Yeah, so what just happened is that the EPA set drinking water standards for 6 of these PFAS chemicals to manufacture Teflon used in those nonstick pans, as well as PFOS, an ingredient used in Scotchgard, as well as firefighting foam and a number of other uses. And so these chemicals are extremely prevalent in drinking water systems across the country. They can actually be found in nearly every single person's blood in the United States.
Dr. Andrews, you were just about to talk a little bit more about how this is prevalent in blood in almost every U.S. American. Talk to me about why that is.
Sure. So these chemicals, because of their incredible widespread use in consumer products and their release into the environment from manufacturing facilities, landfills, electroplating sites, these chemicals end up in nearly every single person in the country that's been tested. They end up in water supplies across the country. And for the first time, there are now going to be mandatory drinking water standards that public water utilities across the country will have to follow or meet to ensure that people are not being overexposed to these chemicals in our drinking water.
And let's talk about some of the people that run these water utilities. We spoke to one last week in Clayton County, and they were frustrated, not because they're now going to have to be required to remove this stuff, but the cost, because local governments, the federal government is now going to be paying for this. Talk to me about exactly what is going to be needed to remove these chemicals from drinking water at these water utilities.
Sure, and I think the first place to start and acknowledge is that the EPA recognized that there are greater economic benefits to this rule than there are in terms of costs. And the current costs are being borne in terms of the general public and increased rates of illness and increased rates of death from exposure to PFAS chemicals. And so the costs are absolutely a concern, and ultimately we believe those should be paid for by the polluters. But ultimately, the benefits of treating drinking water outweigh any of the costs. And water utilities may have to find different sources of water or install treatment, such as granular activated carbon, to remove this contamination from the water. But ultimately, it will be of significant public health as well as economic benefit for society to have these rules in place.
That Clayton County Water Utility Administrator last week said what he wishes the EPA would also do, in addition to adding these new rules and limits of PFAS in drinking water, is set similar limits to products using this, because it seems like this will be an ever-ending cycle of trying to reduce PFAS in our drinking water. But how do you continually do that when you have products that are being used every day and the federal government is allowing these products to use these harmful chemicals? What do you think about that?
I think that's a really important point, and that ultimately we need to eliminate the contamination that's going into the environment, be it from products or contaminated sites. And actually, just this morning, the EPA announced finalizing rules to designate PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances. And this will require companies to clean up contaminated sites and allow EPA to recuperate costs for cleanup. So this should reduce the contamination load going into drinking water systems. So the EPA is actually taking actions that should go after the polluters and the ones who've caused this contamination.
You know, we've done some reporting on PFAS in people's blood. We tested a number of individuals in Rome, Georgia. it's very difficult to find out what the exposure is. Like, how did it impact you? So what are we to do with communities that have been drinking water laced with PFAS, elevated levels of PFAS? Because it seems like it's very difficult to actually get testing for yourself to figure out how you were impacted, right?
Yeah, that's a great question, an important one, especially for communities that have had higher levels of PFAS in their drinking water. That biomonitoring and those studies of impacted communities needs to move forward, and it's great to hear that Emory University is doing additional testing in the area. There are a number of health effects linked to increased exposure. And so it is something that likely area doctors, physicians should be aware of in terms of increased screening. And the National Academies, just a year or two ago, published a guidance on what doctors should be looking for in terms of screening residents for illnesses that are associated with PFAS exposure.
Do we know how many water utilities throughout the country or here in Georgia that will have to be now upgrading their systems because they're currently exceeding the new EPA rule?
So we don't have exact numbers yet. There is mandatory testing that all utilities will have to do over the next 3 years. Implementation is a 5-year time period. But the EPA actually estimates that over water utilities serving over 100 million people will have some impact by this regulation. They estimate that 5,000 water utilities across the country will have to do something, either filter their water or look at alternative sources. And then in terms of the impact in the Georgia area, I know there's a few dozen water utilities across the state that have reported PFAS in their water. But for compliance for this regulation, it's actually the average concentration over a year. So there will be ongoing monitoring and more complete data in the next year or two for the number of water systems across the state that will have to take action. But likely it could easily be a few dozen systems across the state.
You know, as we were just talking, we've done some reporting on PFAS in North Georgia, specifically the Rome, Georgia area, and you're familiar with this because I interviewed you and I asked you to review some PFAS blood level results after we took 11 people and tested their blood. Well, within a month after that story aired, the Emory professor who also took part in that story told me that she was going to then try to find the funding to launch an exposure study. Well, just a few weeks ago, she announced that funding was available, and it's now going to be testing over about 200 people in the Rome area, and not just the Rome area, but surrounding communities that are also being impacted by elevated PFAS in their drinking water. Let's take a look at that story.
All right, so I'm going to pour the water in here now.
Mike Elliott prepares a pot of coffee.
My secret is I use 2 different types of coffees.
While his preferred grind stays consistent, he recently changed the way he makes it. Instead of the tap water he's used for decades, he now uses filtered.
This way it's a lot cleaner.
A change in routine. Following alarming blood test results after Atlanta News First Investigates tested Mike and 10 other Rome, Georgia residents last year for a cancer-causing toxin called perfluoroalkyl, or PFAS for short. Nearly all of their levels above the national median. Mike's twice as high. He shared his frustration during a group interview with test participants last year.
It seems like we should be able to yell and scream at somebody. Something needs to be done. Well, I was mad. I was upset. I didn't understand how that could happen.
The possible source of contamination? Drinking water. State environmental officials identified elevated levels of PFAS in the city's water in 2016. A recently settled lawsuit put the blame on carpet manufacturers using the chemical upriver. The city says its water has been safe for the past 8 years, but it's likely residents drank water laced with PFAS for decades.
All chemical exposures make me mad.
At that group meeting, Emory University professor Dr. Dana Barr told the residents more testing is needed to measure the impact and the source.
It takes money to do things, though. That's the problem, and somebody has to fund it.
About 3 months later, Dr. Barr found the money. The university just announcing it obtained a $35,000 grant to conduct an exposure study to test at least 200 people for PFAS in the Rome area.
It's a very big deal for us. It's a very important issue, and it's a local issue, and it has the possibility of having a big community impact.
What's the value of getting tested?
So the value of getting tested is they'll know how much they've been exposed to, how much of the PFAS they've been exposed to.
The test results could give residents guidance on how to better monitor their health. The National Academy of Sciences recommends people with elevated levels of PFAS to undergo more health screenings to catch potential illnesses early.
How important was our story in getting this funding?
Very important, because we didn't know that this issue existed before your study. In thinking back, it should have been very intuitive that there was going to be an issue because of all the carpet industry and the use of PFAS as stain repellents and water repellents and things like that. But yeah, we just didn't really know about the issue before then.
Hundreds of people about to get answers from exposure to a chemical impacting their community for years.
I think it's fantastic. You've got to start someplace. It's not about pointing fingers, it's about getting answers.